There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house when a woman has been carrying something too long. Not the quiet of peace, not the quiet of rest. The quiet of a person who has learned, over many years, to fold her pain into the smallest possible shape and tuck it somewhere no one will find it. That kind of quiet has a texture. It lives in the way she moves through a kitchen in the early morning before anyone else is awake. It lives in the few seconds she stands at the window, coffee in both hands, looking at nothing in particular. It lives in the small, almost invisible sigh she releases before she puts her smile back on and turns to face her day. Margaret had that quiet. She had carried it for so long that she no longer noticed the weight of it. She had named it patience. She had called it strength. She had told herself, on more mornings than she could count, that this was simply what love looked like when it matured. That the warmth she had felt in the beginning, that particular electricity of being truly seen by someone, had simply settled into something steadier. Something more adult, something real. She believed that for a long time. She believed it through the first hard years of marriage, when money was tight and tension lived in the space between words. She believed it through the raising of two children, through school plays and pediatrician appointments, and the particular exhaustion of being the one who remembers everything. She believed it through the first time she forgave him, and she believed it through the second. And in the believing of it, she built a life, a real one. A life with a yellow kitchen, and a garden that bloomed every spring and neighbors who waved from their driveways, and a family that, from the outside, looked whole. Margaret lived in a small city in the Shenandoah Valley, in the kind of neighborhood where people still knew each other's names. The house was not large, but she had made it beautiful in the way that women who pay attention to things make spaces beautiful, not with expensive furniture or carefully curated decor, but with the steady accumulation of meaning. A quilt her grandmother had made, folded over the arm of the couch. Photographs along the staircase wall, each one marking a moment she had chosen to remember. A kitchen windowsill lined with small clay pots of herbs she grew herself, because she believed that food made with things you grew yourself tasted different, tasted like intention. Her name was Margaret Ann Collier. She was 61 years old. She had gray beginning at her temples that she had stopped coloring 3 years ago, a decision her daughter had cheered, and her husband, Dennis, had said nothing about either way. She had worked for 22 years as an administrative coordinator at a regional healthcare network, the kind of job where you become the person everyone depends on without ever receiving the title that reflects it. She was organized, methodical, warm. She remembered birthdays. She knew which of her colleagues took their coffee with 2 sugars and which ones were quietly struggling and needed someone to just ask how they were doing with enough gentleness that they might actually answer honestly. She was, in every way that counted in the daily fabric of ordinary life, a woman who showed up. Dennis Collier was 64. He had worked in property management for most of their married life, a job that suited him because it kept him moving, kept him in conversation with people, kept him from having to sit too long in silence with anyone, including himself. He was a man who was easy to like. That had always been part of the difficulty. He laughed in the right places. He shook hands with the right firmness. He remembered the names of people's dogs and asked about their renovations, and had a kind of surface warmth that made strangers feel immediately at ease. People often told Margaret she was lucky. She had believed that too for a long time. The first time she forgave him was in the 8th year of their marriage. She did not use the word affair. She told herself it was a lapse, a weakness, a period of pressure and poor choices that had nothing to do with who she was to him or what they had built together. She said these things quietly to herself in the bathroom with the door locked in the weeks after she found out, and then she came out and she continued. Because there were children, because there was the life. Because she genuinely loved him in the complicated, weathered way you love a person who has become part of your architecture, and walking away from architecture is not the same as walking out a door. They went to counseling for 4 months. The therapist was kind, a woman with soft eyes and careful questions, and Dennis sat in those sessions with something that looked enough like remorse that Margaret chose to receive it as the real thing. He was attentive for a while afterward, more present. He cooked dinner on Sue N days and came to more of the children's events and said thank you more often, and Margaret told herself that this was what growth looked like. That the rupture had, in some painful way, created space for something better to grow. For a few years, she almost believed that. Second time was quieter, less dramatic in the conventional sense. It was not another woman exactly, or if it was, Margaret never found the proof she would have needed to name it out loud. What she found instead was a pattern of absences, a series of evenings that did not add up, a phone that was always face down on the counter, and a husband who had developed the habit of answering questions slightly too smoothly, slightly too quickly, in the way people do when they have rehearsed their answers in advance. She felt it before she could name it. It lived in her body, in the stomach drop sensation she got when he walked in later than expected with a reason that was just a little too complete. She confronted him that time in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her arms crossed over her chest in the posture of a woman trying to hold herself together. He denied it. He was wounded, almost convincingly. He said she was looking for reasons to be suspicious, that she had never fully let go of the past, that what she was calling instinct was actually old grief in a new costume. And because she was tired, and because she had invested so much, and because the alternative felt like demolishing everything with her own hands, she let herself be persuaded. She called it forgiving. It took her years to understand what she had actually been doing. The children grew. Kayla, the elder, became a physical therapist and moved to Raleigh with her husband and eventually her own two small children. She had Margaret's eyes and Dennis's ease in a room, and she called her mother every Sunday without fail, which was a kind of love Margaret felt in her bones. Thomas, 4 years younger than his sister, worked in IT and lived 40 minutes north, close enough to visit without warning and far enough that he rarely did. He was a quieter person, more careful with his words, the kind of young man who observed more than he spoke. Margaret sometimes caught him watching his father with an expression she could not quite name. She never asked about it. The years moved, grandchildren arrived, the garden expanded. Margaret became someone her coworkers called for guidance and her neighbors called when they needed a person with a level head, and she gave what she had to give, and she went home in the evenings to a house that was functionally peaceful. Dennis had retired 2 years before her. He puttered. He watched too much television. He had a standing coffee with two men from his old professional network on Tuesday mornings, and he was generally out of her way, which had come to feel, if not like happiness, then at least like the absence of active pain. She told herself that was enough. The spring she turned 61 was mild and slow. The dogwood in the front yard bloomed early, great pale arms of white blossoms that made the whole front of the house look like something from a painting. Margaret had taken an early retirement package her company offered, and she was navigating the particular identity shift of no longer having a professional structure to move through, which was stranger than she had anticipated. She had thought she would feel free. Instead, she felt slightly untethered, as if a long, familiar anchor had been lifted, and she was not entirely sure of her direction. She began sorting through things. It was a practical project. The house had accumulated decades of accumulated life, closets and drawers, and the particular archaeological layers of a family home that had not been substantially cleared in years. She started in the basement, then the upstairs hall closet, then the spare room that had once been Thomas's bedroom and had since become a kind of neutral territory where things got stored when no one knew where else to put them. It was in this room, on a Thursday afternoon in late April, when the light came through the window in long horizontal strips, that she found the box. It was not hidden exactly. It was on the highest shelf of the closet, behind a broken printer they had always meant to take to recycling, and a box of old tax documents, and a rolled-up poster from a concert Dennis had attended in 1987. It was a shoebox, old and soft at the corners, with the flaps folded into each other the way you fold a box when you want it to stay closed without tape. Margaret lifted it down simply because she was clearing the shelf. She had no particular expectation of it. She carried it to the bed and sat down and opened it. Inside were papers, some photographs, a few folded documents with the kind of formal legal creasing that meant they had been opened and refolded many times. Margaret looked at them slowly, the way you look at something when your mind has registered. Aired that something is wrong before your thoughts have fully arranged themselves around what that wrong thing is. There was a marriage certificate. Dennis Eugene Collier, and a woman named Patrice Lynn Harmon, married in Charlottesville, Virginia, on September 14, 1984. Margaret did not move for a long moment. She and Dennis had married in June of 1988. She looked at the certificate again. Read every word of it with the careful attention of someone who wants to be absolutely certain they are not misunderstanding what they are reading. She was not misunderstanding. The document was not ambiguous. It was a legal record of a marriage that had taken place 4 years before her own wedding. A marriage Dennis had never mentioned, not once. Not in the early conversations of courtship, when people tell each other who they are. Not during the months of engagement. Not in the counseling sessions, when the therapist had specifically asked both of them to talk about what they had brought to the marriage from their pasts. Not ever. She sat on that bed for a long time. The room was very quiet. Outside, a bird was making short, repeated sounds in the dogwood tree. The late afternoon light had shifted to something lower and warmer. Margaret held the marriage certificate in both hands and felt something she could only describe later as the floor of her life going soft beneath her. Because it was not simply the existence of a previous marriage that undid her. It was the calculation of what that concealment meant. Everything she thought she had forgiven him for, she had forgiven it without full information. Every choice she had made to stay, to believe, to rebuild, she had made as a person who did not know the whole truth about who she was married to. Every version of herself that had chosen generosity, chosen patience, chosen to look past the evidence her own instincts had given her, all of that had been chosen inside a story that was not the real one. She thought about the therapist's soft eyes and careful questions. She thought about sitting in that office and believing that honest communication was what was happening. She thought about Dennis's rehearsed smoothness, the face-down phone on the counter, the explanations that were always just complete enough. She thought about Patris Lynn Harmon, and she sat very still. Margaret did not confront Dennis that evening. She made dinner. She set the table. She asked him about his Tuesday coffee meeting, and he said it was fine, and they ate, and she listened to him talk, and she looked at his face, and she thought, I do not know you. I have never known you. And the strange thing was that this did not make her cry. It made her feel, beneath the shock and the grief and the seismic shifting of everything she thought was solid, a very quiet, very cold clarity. She was a woman who had always known how to wait for the right moment. She called Kayla the next morning after Dennis left for his coffee meeting. She did not tell her everything. She told her enough that she had found something, that she needed to process it, that she might need her daughter's clear head in the coming weeks. Kayla was at work, but she stepped outside and she listened, and when Margaret finished speaking there was a pause and Kayla said, quietly and without drama, Mom, what do you need? That question, those 4 words. Margaret had not realized until that moment how rarely anyone had asked her that, with genuine open space around it. She called an attorney the following week. Not in town, she drove 40 minutes south, to a woman a friend from work had recommended years ago in an entirely different context, a family attorney with a reputation for being direct without being cold. Her name was Sandra Ackefer, and she had a corner office and a manner that Margaret immediately trusted. Margaret brought the box. She laid the documents on the desk. Sandra Ackefer reviewed them in silence, asked several methodical questions, and then looked at Margaret with the measured expression of a woman who has seen many things and respects the people who arrive in her office with them. There were implications, Sandra explained. If the divorce from Patris had not been legally finalized before Dennis married Margaret, or if it had never happened at all, then Margaret and Dennis's marriage had a legal status that was not what Margaret had believed it to be for 36 years. There were financial considerations. There were considerations around how property was held. There were questions that needed answers before anything else. Margaret nodded and wrote down what Sandra told her to write down, and drove home in the late morning sun, with a very straight back and the beginnings of a plan. She was not angry in the way people imagine anger. She was not screaming inside her own head. She was something quieter and more dangerous than angry. She was decided. She found Patris Lynn Harmon on the internet in an evening. It took less time than she expected. Patris was 63, she was in Richmond, she appeared to have a daughter and a garden and a job at a school administrative office. She looked, from the few photographs Margaret studied on social media, like a woman who had lived a full life, a woman who had come through something and continued. Margaret stared at her face for a long moment and felt not animosity, but something closer to grief on behalf of both of them. 2 women, years apart, navigating the edges of the same man's capacity for concealment. She did not reach out to Patris, not yet. What she needed first was the documented truth. Dennis came home one evening about 3 weeks after Margaret found the box to find her sitting at the dining room table with the shoebox in front of her. She had made no particular preparations for atmosphere. She had not rehearsed a speech. She simply sat, and when he came through the door, she said his name with the particular flatness of a person who no longer needs to perform composure, because composure has become something real inside them. He looked at the box, and his face did something complicated. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the box and placed the marriage certificate on the table between them, and did not say anything else. What happened in the next hour was not a confrontation in the way Margaret had imagined confrontations from the movies she had seen. There was no shouting. There was no shattering of objects. There was instead a long, terrible unwinding of denial in which Dennis moved through several inadequate responses, beginning with minimization, moving through deflection, arriving eventually at a version of explanation that was still not entirely honest, but was honest enough that the shape of the truth became visible. He and Patris had married young. It had lasted less than 2 years. The divorce had been filed, but he had never, he said this quietly, looking at the table, he had never entirely confirmed that the paperwork had been completed on Patris's side. He had moved to a different part of the state. He had told himself it was handled. He had told himself this so many times that it had stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like something that simply existed in a category he did not need to examine. "You told yourself," Margaret said. "Margaret, you told yourself, and then you married me, and you sat in a therapist's office with me, and you talked about honesty and trust, and you told yourself." He did not have an answer for that. There was no answer for that. Margaret told him that she had spoken to an attorney. She told him that she would be speaking to her attorney again. She told him, with a calm that she would remember later as one of the most quietly powerful things she had ever done, that the decisions about what came next were hers to make, and that she would make them on her own timeline, with her own counsel, and that she required him to understand that clearly. She went to bed that night and she did not sleep much, but she did not cry either. She lay in the dark and she thought about the woman she had been: careful, forgiving, steady, and she did not feel contempt for her. That woman had done the best she could with the information she had. That woman had built something real out of the materials she was given, even when some of those materials were false. That woman had raised two people who were, against meaningful odds, emotionally honest and genuinely good. That was not a failure. That was not wasted time. That was her life, and it was hers. Thomas came on a Saturday not long after. He arrived without calling ahead, which was unusual enough that Margaret was already putting the kettle on when she heard his car in the drive. He sat at the kitchen table, and she sat across from him, and she told him most of what she knew, because Thomas was old enough and careful enough, and had a right to understand why the structure of his family was about to shift. He listened the way he had always listened, completely, without interruption, with the particular stillness that had always distinguished him. When she finished, he looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at her and said, "Mom, I always knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know what." She asked him what he meant. He said simply that he had spent years watching his father navigate conversations with a kind of practiced ease that felt, to him, like the ease of someone who had significant practice, not telling the truth. He said he hadn't trusted his own instincts because Dennis was convincing, and he was young, and it had felt disloyal to name something he couldn't prove. He said he was sorry he hadn't said anything. Margaret told him that was not his burden to carry, that it had never been his job to solve what was wrong in his parents' marriage, that the only person responsible for the truth in a relationship is the person who knows it. He came around the table and hugged her in the straightforward way of a person who means it entirely, and Margaret held on for a moment and then straightened and said, "I'm going to be all right." She meant it. The legal process was not simple or fast. Sandra Ackeffer was methodical and thorough, and what emerged over the following months was a picture that was complicated in ways Margaret had not fully anticipated. The divorce between Dennis and Patris had been filed but never formally finalized. There was a gap in the record, a piece of paperwork that had existed in the uncertain territory of two young people dissolving a marriage without enough legal literacy to ensure every step was completed. What that meant for Margaret's marriage, legally, was a question that required time and documentation to fully answer. What it meant for Margaret personally was something she could see clearly without anyone's legal guidance. It meant that the foundation had always had a crack, and the crack had not appeared because of carelessness or misfortune. It had been placed there by a man who had decided that some truths were his alone to manage, regardless of who else was living inside them. She moved through this period with the steadiness that had always been her nature, but she also did something she had not done in years. She began talking to people honestly, not performing fine, not managing the narrative to protect everyone's comfort. She talked to Kayla every Sunday, and she let those conversations be real. She visited a grief counselor, not because she was falling apart, but because she had the wisdom, finally, to understand that some things needed witnessed processing, not just private endurance. The counselor was a woman close to Margaret's age, sharp and compassionate, and their sessions felt less like therapy in the clinical sense and more like the conversation Margaret had always needed and had never quite given herself permission to have. She told the counselor about the quilts on the arm of the couch, and the herbs on the kitchen windowsill, and the photographs up the staircase. She talked about the life she had made. The counselor asked her how she felt about that life, now that she knew what she knew. Margaret thought about it honestly before she answered. She said that she did not want to reverse it. She said she did not think of it as a false life, even knowing what she now knew. She said that her children were real, and her relationships were real, and the work she had done in that house and in that community and in that office for 22 years was real, and that a man's concealment did not retroactively hollow out everything she had built. She said, I was the truth in my own life, even when he wasn't. The counselor wrote nothing down. She just looked at Margaret with a kind of recognition. Dennis moved to a rental apartment in town in the fall. The separation was quiet in the way things are quiet when the people involved are past the age of dramatic exits and have too much life experience to confuse volume with feeling. He took his clothes and some furniture from the spare room and the television from the den, and Margaret stood in the door of the house on the morning he finished loading his car, and she felt something she had not felt in years standing in that doorway. Space. Not emptiness, not absence. Space in the sense of room to breathe, room to think, room to take up the full shape of herself without calibrating it against someone else's discomfort or disapproval or invisible requirements. She spent a long evening after he left rearranging the living room. It was a small change, practical on the surface. She moved the couch to face the window instead of the television, because she had always preferred to look at the garden when she sat in the afternoon, but it felt, in the way that small practical changes sometimes do, like the beginning of something true. She made tea. She sat in the repositioned couch. She looked at the garden in the low autumn light, the late flowers, the browning edges of things preparing for winter and for whatever came after. She was not happy in the uncomplicated way of people who have not yet been through anything. She was something quieter and more durable than happy. She was present. She was hers. Kayla came for Thanksgiving with her husband and both children, and Thomas came too, and they sat around the table that Margaret had set with the good dishes she had always saved for occasions, and had decided this year to stop saving. The meal was long, and the children were loud in the wonderful way of small children who have not yet learned to regulate their joy for the benefit of others. And there was laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes from genuine moments rather than social obligation. At some point in the evening, after the children had been settled in front of a movie, and the adults were sitting with their wine glasses in the warm kitchen, Kayla looked at her mother and said, You low. Okay, different. Margaret asked what she meant. Kayla thought about it. You look like yourself, she said. Thomas, from across the table, nodded once. Margaret thought about that in the nights that followed. She thought about who herself was, who the self was that her daughter could now see clearly in her face. She thought about the girl who had married in 1988 with enormous hopefulness, the young mother who had packed lunches and driven to practices and folded laundry late at night with the quiet diligence of someone who believed that care was its own form of love. She thought about the woman who had forgiven twice and built twice and held the shape of a life together through force of will and genuine devotion. She thought about all the mornings at the window with the coffee, looking at nothing in particular, carrying the weight she had named patience. She did not feel that weight anymore. What she felt instead was something she had not had words for in a long time. It was not the electricity of new love, that particular brightness of being first discovered. It was something older and more substantial. It was the feeling of being inside her own life fully, of moving through her days as the main character rather than the supporting presence in someone else's story. It was the feeling of a woman who had done the work. Not perfectly, not without missteps, not without the particular costs that come from loving someone unwisely, and had come through it in possession of herself. She started a writing group in the new year, meeting on Thursday evenings at the library with 7 other women, most of them around her age, all of them carrying various forms of the accumulated histories that come from living a full life in the world. They wrote short pieces, personal essays, memory fragments. Margaret wrote about the garden. She wrote about her grandmother's quilt. She wrote about the morning she found the box, and what the light in the room looked like, and how long she had sat on the bed, and what she had felt in her body and her hands. She did not write it as a story of betrayal. She wrote it as a story about a woman learning, late in the particular and irreplaceable way that late realizations happen, what she was actually made of. The group gave her a standing ovation the evening she read it aloud. She told them not to be dramatic. They did it anyway. Spring came again. The dogwood bloomed. Margaret was in the garden on an April Saturday, her hands in the soil, dividing the bulbs she had planted the previous autumn, when she became aware of being precisely content. Not in spite of everything. Not as a triumph over the past. Just content in the simple and profound sense of a person who is exactly where she is, doing exactly what she is doing, without any part of herself split off managing some other concern. She thought about something the counselor had said to her once. In one of their early sessions, when Margaret had asked what she was supposed to feel about having given so much of herself to a person who had not been entirely honest with her. The counselor had looked at her for a moment and then said, "The giving was yours. What he did with it doesn't change what you brought. The love was real. The intention was real. You were real." Margaret had thought about that sentence many times in the months since. She had turned it over in quiet moments and examined it from different angles, the way you examine a thing you are trying to fully understand. And what she had come to, slowly and without drama, was this: that a life built from real intention is not a false life, even when the other person in it was not what they appeared to be. That her integrity had not been invalidated by his dishonesty. That she had been, in every room of that house and every year of that marriage and every morning at that window, genuinely herself, genuinely loving, genuinely trying, genuinely real. And that was not a loss. That was the foundation she actually stood on. She finished dividing the bulbs. She washed her hands at the outdoor spigot. She looked at the garden, at the early green things coming up and the beds she was redesigning this year, making more space for things she had always wanted to grow and never quite gotten around to. She looked at the yellow house behind her, warm in the April light, with the photograph still climbing the staircase wall and the quilt still on the couch and the herbs still on the kitchen windowsill. It was her house, hers entirely now in every sense that mattered. She dried her hands on her jeans. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden with the coffee in both hands, and for the first time in as many years as she could count back, the quiet around her was not the quiet of carrying. It was simply the quiet of a woman who had arrived, through difficulty and clarity and the patient accumulation of her own honesty, at something solid. Yet, herself. And she was, standing there in the warm kitchen with the spring light on the windowsill herbs, unmistakably and completely at peace.